Hello and welcome to part 5 of my deconstruction of Bernardo Kastrup's series course called Analytic Idealism, or Analytic Idealism course, and it's a deconstruction of his part 4. Now, before I head into this, this morning I got what's it called, in YouTube jail, apparently because Essentia Foundation, represented by Bernardo Kastrup here, had given YouTube a notice of me infringing upon some copyright in the third part I had made in this series. And they written that apparently I have, done something about some copyright, which I'm not sure of. Well, in some sense, if Bernardo Kastrup or anybody else makes a video and I comment on that video in my video, well, you could say it's sort of a copyright of that whatever, right? But if that's the level of copyright we are dealing with here, then there's a lot of things you can find on YouTube that shouldn't be there, that is obvious, right? There are, copies of old movies. You can basically find all the music ever recorded in history and so on, books and, all sorts of stuff, or what's it called, audiobooks or whatever that is not exactly sounding like it's without copyright, right? So YouTube shouldn't, if they are very concerned about copyright, I think they ought to run through a bit of their sort of music and videos and movies and so on, and figure out whether or not there's some copyright infringement there. So when it comes to copyright, I'm not that sort of impressed by YouTube's standard. It seems like in some cases you can basically do nothing and you'll get a copyright strike. In other cases, you can, use basically anything. And I have a sense that it also depends on what channel you are and how you fit into the sort of political correctness. Whether you have been flagged already as a bad apple, then they will do anything to sort of get rid of you using whatever tool. And one of those tools might be a copyright infringement. So I don't know, right? That's one of the annoying things. At least they could tell me what the fuck I've done wrong, right? So, and it does. You have, infringed upon copyright, and then have a strike, a cut in the clip in the whatever in your diary here on YouTube, and if you get enough of them, you will be kicked off YouTube, basically, right? So that's sort of the authoritarian style that YouTube has, which I don't, I'm not particularly fond of that way of dealing with your customers, right? But in this case, I'm not taking any chances. I've looked through this video beforehand, and there's nothing that seems to me to be particularly, except if the video in itself is considered some kind of copyright. Okay, then a lot of people are infringing on copyrights when they deconstruct or comment or whatever on things, right? So, and my videos are not monetized, and I'm only asking for a donation, every other video. So it can't be because I'm trying to make a buck from this, and I'm not really sure that it's a good business model. Deconstructing, spending 1.5 hours deconstructing a Bernardo Kastrup video and expecting to make money off of it, right? But let me have a sip of my tea. What I'm doing then now is to make sure that I don't get more strikes, is that if you're going to view this deconstruction, you can have the video open in another browser window, and then you can start and stop in the same fashion as I do, but I have placed the beautiful face and video on top of that presentation area that Bernardo uses in his video, so that you won't be able to watch anything but his words. So if I'm referring to some kind of graphics, then it will be you will have to have the video running beside you in order to, and maybe it makes sense anyway that you don't need the graphics, which is basically mostly my conclusion, right? So you possibly won't need the. I mean, if I've got a copyright strike for that picture that he presented of David Chalmers, he possibly have snapped himself. Well, okay, I would be fine if it wasn't there. I don't give a crap about David Chalmers, basically, or pictures of him, right? So it's like, I don't care, right? So I'm just placed my big beardy face on top of his video, and let's just head into it and see how it goes. This is a long one. It's more than 1.5 hours long, and the other videos he has made in this series until now has been around half an hour, I think. So this I might have to chop this up in smaller pieces, depending on how much I need to say about it, right? So, okay, first of all, he calls it Analytic Idealism. It's part 4. Now he's going to present his own metaphysics as opposed to the bad metaphysics he has presented in the previous videos, right? And I commented on that also, which I thought was sort of a tactic that is, well, look at all that bad philosophy and that bad philosophy, and now I'm going to tell you about my superior philosophy, right? It has sort of an authoritarian, slightly sophist approach to it, right? And as he says, analytic idealism, a superior hypothesis. Now, I'm not expert on hypotheses, conjectures, theories, and a sort of we are dealing with some kind of, isn't it a kind of scientific method we're dealing with when we are saying we have a hypothesis? I'm not sure about. I remember reading about it a few years back, trying to figure out what the differences were, but I don't actually remember. But what I would like to say is I don't think that hypothesis is a term that should be used in metaphysics, right? It's not a hypothesis. A hypothesis can only be about that which you can know, right? And if we are dealing with something you know, or you need to know before you can hypothesize about it, well, then you need to do some epistemology, or at least there has to be some reference somewhere in his philosophy to how he gets to some kind of knowledge. If he's proposing some kind of new metaphysics that sort of, might turn a few tables here and there, right? He also needs to get through epistemology in order to tell you how he would approach the idea of knowledge before he can talk about hypotheses. So I think it's a misnomer in that it's a misplaced term in metaphysics, but that's just sort of my little point, right? So, okay, let's head into analytic idealism, a superior hypothesis.
Welcome back to Essential Foundation's Analytic Idealism course. Last time, in part 3, we covered constitutive panpsychism. We've discussed the fact that panpsychism...
Oh, yeah. Why is he only... That's just occurred to me. I don't know why it didn't occur to me before. But he's talking about panpsychism, and in particular what he calls constitutive panpsychism. But that means there must be other kinds of panpsychism. Why hasn't he presented those also, right? It's also that he has presented sort of materialism and constitutive panpsychism, and now he presents a third option, which is his own. But are there more? There's monism and dualism and skeptical idealism, and there are all sorts of solipsism, all sorts of approaches to metaphysics. Wouldn't it be a good idea to have some kind of overview about, and I could, grab my own tits and say, well, maybe I should do that, but I'm not, a PhD in philosophy, right? And I'm not particularly concerned about all these various academic groupings of metaphysics. I have my own idea, which I find to be the most skeptical approach you can take on metaphysics and still get somewhere, right? Okay, let's head in.
Seems to be motivated on a fallacious logical bridge on the notion that the structure of the world perceived should also be the structure of the perceiver, of the subject of perception. Now, this logical bridge is arbitrary, so panpsychism is sort of motivated by an arbitrary bridge. We've also discussed why panpsychism entails an insoluble problem comparable to the hard problem of consciousness, namely the subject combination problem. There is no coherent and explicit account under panpsychism, under constitutive panpsychism, for how ostensive feuds of subjectivity, which are supposed to be fundamentally separate and distinct, can somehow combine into a higher order, unitary seeming feud of subjectivity. In other words, how the ostensive little consciousnesses of the subatomic particles constituting my brain can combine to make up my unitary consciousness, my unitary conscious inner life. There is no account of that.
Why is he still talking about panpsychism? I don't really get it, right? It's like, by the way, you still understand that this panpsychism shit is not very good. So when I present my metaphysics, you understand that it's much better and it's actually the best one, right? It's superior, right? It's a sort of very sophist polemic, sort of, right?
And there probably cannot be already in principle any account of that because it's arguably incoherent. And finally, we've seen that constitutive panpsychism is physically incoherent insofar as it depends on the notion that elementary subatomic particles, which are supposed to be conscious, are themselves little bodies with discrete, definite boundaries in space.
Now, there's a point there you might want to criticize in his presentation. It would be nice to have some kind of reference to panpsychists who actually proposes that they think of these elementary particles as little bodies, right? Rather than spheres of swarms or whatever stuff, right? Maybe he's got it wrong. I don't know, but it would be nice to have that particular presentation. If it's part of the argument, why not bring in some kind of statement from somewhere where somebody is saying, I'm panpsychist and I support little bodies, right? So it's just, I don't know, it's just not very rigid argumentation in my opinion, right?
We've seen that what we call elementary subatomic particles are simply patterns of excitation of a spatially
There it is again, excitation, patterns of excitation, right? You're just bringing in a new word without explaining anything. When you're doing metaphysics, you cannot take terms for granted. You have to anchor your terms in your reduction base, right? Otherwise, you're just farting in the wind. You're just, making noises, right? It has to be referenced somehow what you mean. Just adding a term that might trigger something in people's mind and say, I guess it sounds like it could be right, but I'm not sure, right? No, that's not good philosophy. You have to make a definition or a reference somehow to how you get to this new term and what does it mean when you say it, right? What the hell is an excitation? And if you're talking about that realm beyond your experiences, how the hell do you know about it? Are you just making up whatever you want to connect the dots your way? Or what, right? This is simply too lazy to function as a rigid philosophy, right?
Bound quantum.
Or maybe it's just like, but the little peons, they won't understand it. They'll eat it raw because I'm PhD squared. So I am, they'll just say, but Bernardo says, right? Bernardo says it's little ripples out there. Oh, I guess he's right. It's like, so you're preaching to the one-eyed king of the blind, so to say, right? It's like, well, if I need to pound on something scientific, there's this paper that was written back then, and you can go and read this very, articulate and scientific paper that you will need an IQ of 175 to understand, or you will get my sort of very loose and lazy presentation in order to convince you that I'm right and I'm superior, right? So it's sort of this bridge between high-level scientific papers and very low-level street cred philosophy, right?
Refute. Therefore, panpsychism fails to account for separate minds, and that is sort of the final straw to discard panpsychism. So now we've covered 3 modules, parts 1, 2, and 3, and in each one of them we've sort of destroyed a common idea or a common intuition in our culture today. In part 1, we've argued for the incoherence of our regular, ordinary intuitions about the nature of the world. In part 2, we've done the same for mainstream physicalism, and in part 3, for constitutive panpsychism. So it has been sort of a journey of destruction so far. So it's time for us to take a turn and offer.
Okay, I just remember that I wanted to say something that from earlier in the start, and he hasn't delved into his real presentation yet. But I wrote an email to Essentia Foundation in the hope, using the form on their webpage, in the hope that they'll respond and tell me what exactly it is that they think I've done wrong, right? So I expect to get a very thorough and explanation of what it is that they think I've done wrong. And so I can, remove whatever it is that I don't like, so that I can get on with this and reinstate my part 3 on YouTube, right? And they will retract their claim, or whatever it's called, right? So this kind of a warfare is sort of pathetic, in my opinion, right? Okay, just a little comment there, right?
For some construction, offer some coherent alternative that is not only coherent, but internally, logically consistent, empirically adequate, conceptually parsimonious, and explanatorily powerful. An option that holds up to scrutiny. And that's what this part 4 is about.
But your metaphysics doesn't have to explain anything, right? What does it need to explain, right? You can't explain color. If you have an experience of red, can you explain that? Can you tell me whether or not I should have that experience or not? No, you can't. And I suppose you can't do that about your own similar kind of experiences, right? If I have an objectification or cognition of, for instance, an elephant, can you explain elephant for me? Right? Can you explain elephant? Can you tell me whether or not I should experience or shouldn't? Or is it a wrong kind of elephant, or whatever? Or explain elephant is this, right? Well, then you're going to reference my reduction base, which is the qualia, which is an elephant is this and also maybe shapes, right? But that's a reduction base. You're not explaining anything. You're just going back to the reduction base. The reduction base, which you cannot explain any further. So what are you actually explaining by this? There's nothing to explain in metaphysics. It is a mindfuck, right? You don't even understand what the hell you're doing. What you think you're doing apparently is you are trying to explain your experience by explaining what is going on beyond experience and then why it becomes that experience. Now that is something that is completely ridiculous, because you can't do that. You can't do that, right? You can fabulate all you want, but there's nothing you can use in order to figure out what the hell is out there, right? It's just a weird kind of philosophy, this, right? Metaphysics doesn't explain anything. Nothing.
It's the part that gives the name to the course, Analytic Idealism, which I will argue is not only a superior hypothesis, I think it is the only tenable hypothesis on the table today. So, enough of that. Let's get right to it. To begin with, let's first acknowledge, and I did that at the end of the previous part, let's acknowledge some basic observations about reality. Number one, we do seem to share the same.
What is reality? Some basic observation. But what's that? Well, if I close my eyes and deprive myself of my senses, I don't have any experience. So there's no reality in that at that point, right? I have a memory or something like that, and inductions and whatever. But that's not reality. That's my my hard disk that somehow works in that fashion, right? So now you're sort of just slamming words and terms on the table and saying, "Oh, that's reality, and let's take a stab at that." No. You have to work from your reduction base and start to explain from that, right? I'm not saying you have to explain, because I just refuted that as any explanation. What I meant is that you have to establish step by step how you go from your reduction base to the next, right? And maybe it's also a good idea to say, well, my goal with this philosophy is to get to this. And when I get to that, I want to get to this. And then I want to get to this. And ultimately, I would say it is the ultimate level of philosophy is a moral principle, right? That's the end goal, right? How do I get from my reduction base in my metaphysics all the way through epistemology, objectivity, morality, ethics, whatever, and arriving at a moral principle, right? Otherwise, why the hell do all this, right? If you're not going to use it on anything, if you make some very, very good wheels, but you don't make the rest of the car, what the hell am I going to do with your wheels, right? Put it on my old car. So, no. This is just farting in the wind, right?
World. We seem to inhabit a common world. Why? Because
we seem... No. There's no we here. There's only you, right? Talk from your own experience and say, I am experiencing this. I am going with this axiom. I think my experience should be understood like this. And if you agree with me, great, then let's discuss it, right? Otherwise, fine if you don't agree. See you another time, right? This we is a bad way of doing it. I'm up in arms at immediately when somebody says, we think this way, we experience this, we can do this, we can't do this. There is no we. Cut that out of it, right?
If you were to be sitting here next to me in my study, you would describe my study in a way very consistent with my own description of it. We all seem to agree that we...
But the description doesn't mean that there would necessarily be the same experience. If I had a completely different experience, but had learned to use the same terms for my experience, you would think it's the same experience, but I'm just using words to describe something else. But because I'm used to experiencing in another way and using the same terms for that same object, so to say, right? Then we could agree upon it, even if we have ultimately vastly different experiences, right?
We live in a world where there is...
If I'm used to experience the color I would call yellow, but you and call it yellow, but you are experiencing what I would call red, but for the same object that other people call yellow, you would be used to call that yellow. Even if you experience you would red, but you wouldn't know the difference because all you ever experience when you see that color is red. You have in mind yellow color, right? You wouldn't know that. There's no way for you to know that. The problem of other minds. The zombie problem, right? So it's a weird. You're talking again from abstractions, right? You are jumping straight into abstractions and you're just leaving your reduction base behind, right? As if that's just something that has to be there so you can keep talking about your abstractions. No, you can't jump into abstractions without explaining precisely what you mean, right? Well, how you get from your reduction base, which I would say is your qualia, to objectifications and abstractions.
Gravity, where there are trees, other people, cars, buildings, stars in the night sky, and so on. So whatever this shared world may actually be, however
Shared world? How the hell do you know? Have you heard about the problem of other minds? Oh my God. You're just saying, well, okay, it's a built-in axiom that you're saying my experience is of the same kind that other minds have, and therefore we can discuss it. Okay, but would you mind stating some axioms that says, well, I'm working from this axiom, right? That would be a good sort of rigid kind of arguing these things. I mean, the closer you get to the bottom level of philosophy, which is down here in the deepest levels of metaphysics, you have to be strict with this, right? It has to be freaking clear what you mean by your reduction base, and it has to be freaking clear how you get to the next step and to the next step and what axioms you are working from, right? You can't just throw around words this way. Well, I guess you can, but then I'm going to deconstruct it and tell you you're full of shit, right? So,
misleading our ordinary intuitions of it may be, there is a shared world. There is something that can play the role of a shared.
But how is it shared? What do you mean by shared? If I can't experience it, right? So you're saying I am, or my mind, or my experience is in that world. And it's separated from it, right? So you're saying that world that the experience is a representation of, let's use that term, right? Representation. That outside world is what we share. But how do we share it if we are separate? Then it's a contradiction to say we're sharing it. Yeah, what our bodies, whatever it is that are connected to our mind, is in that realm, but we have no experience of it. We can only fabulate, and that fabulation might end up being something that destroys a good kind of philosophy. So this shared world, it's sort of, it's a we and collectivism, and we are all together in this. But I'm the only one. I'm the priest who can tell you, right? It's sort of, I'm really, really, I'm careful to look for this, right? These little steps where we jump into some kind of collectivism and say, no, we are all, right? It's actually very clear here that that's what it's doing. We are in this together, and you can't get out, right?
Shared world. I think that is an undeniable empirical observation.
And maybe it's a sort of, I have a sort of a sort of an idea working from that 99.9% of people in the world don't, or let me put it this way, they like freedom as long as it's their own freedom, but they don't like that other people have freedom, right? They like freedom to the extent that they can benefit from it themselves, but they don't like that other people have freedom to choose, right? They don't like that people could choose not to engage with you at all, right? If you realized I have nothing to offer anybody, so nobody will come and deal with me or negotiate with me or, I can trade with or anything like that, right? That's why there's a welfare state. People want freedom for themselves. That they fucking want everybody else to be enslaved into some system where they are forced to participate with you, right? They're forced to engage with you in some way or another, right? And I think that notion of we come from that anxiety deep down inside, that you are basically alone and you are dependent on other people. In the sense, in order to get what you want, you need to somehow engage with them. And if you need to engage with them, and there's a system that basically can force them to engage with you, well, you're connecting the dots is not that difficult, right? So force-feeding people with this sense of we, and you're in this, and we're in this together, and you can't get out, and you have to pay, and sort of this. It all stems from this anxiety, I believe. But that's just my 2 cents, right?
Number 2, we can't change the world simply by wishing it to be different. I realize I made an error in the numbering here. Bear with me. Look, if we could change the world like we can change the course of our daydreaming by simply imagining it to be different, the world would be different right now because I wish it to be different. I would eliminate many of the problems that I see around.
But what you see around, what are we talking about? You are unclear now, right? What you see around you must be an experience because you're calling it see, so you're using your 5 senses. And you're referring to qualia indirectly. But that's not what you're trying to talk about, that other thing, that, shared world or whatever it is, right? So now you're jumping into experiences all of a sudden. And then you're jumping back out on the other side of experience and what? It's unclear what we're dealing with, right? It's confusing, and you're sort of, maybe it's a sort of a sophist attempt to, blur the lines between when we are talking about experience and when we are actually talking about that is inexperiential or unexperiential or unknowable, or how we would want to put it, right? Kant's noumena. Maybe you should call it noumena, right?
Around the world today simply by wishing them away and replacing them with something more positive and more harmonious. But I can't do that, and presumably neither can you. So whatever this world is, it is not acquiescent to our inner volition, to our whims, desires.
So whatever you're thinking cannot influence what is out there, but you can still, you have access because you can talk about it or what. It's just very unclear what you're saying, because it also seems to jump between it's inaccessible, but now I'm going to talk about it. I'm talking about it as if implicitly I can say something about it, and then 2 sentences later it's sort of inaccessible and untouchable or unchangeable or something like that. As it's just sort of very, very fluffy, this, right? I'm having my guards up completely now. Sort of, okay, I'm not taking anything on its word, right?
Desires and fears. It is whatever it is, independently of us. It does what it does, regardless of whether we like it or not. And the third fact.
It does what it does. It's like, well, okay, it does what it does. Okay, yeah, okay. But you don't even know if there's any doing there, right? Any action, whatever term. It's also hard to put words on it, because all the terms, as I said in earlier chapters, is something that is used to describe the experiential thing, right? So what terms do you use for that which you have never experienced? It's difficult, right? And that's why I'm saying, leave it the frick alone, right? Don't fabulate about what is going on out there, because it doesn't matter. Maybe it's to some extent what he's trying to say. But why are you spending time on it then, right? Get to the reduction base, and then start from there and start to build something that will eventually end up being a definition of, or a delineation of where we can talk about knowledge, right? That's what we want to know. We want to know whether or not there is a pandemic or not, right? We want to know whether or not we should take some stupid ass test tube up our ass because somebody says so, right? Or needle, not a test tube.
Number 2 in the slide. Inner experience correlates with brain function. It would be naive to deny this, and you don't even need to be a sophisticated neuroscience and get into the neural correlates of consciousness as studied through.
I might add a comment to the way my vocabulary, my way of my emo type of lingo. Let's put it that way, right? But I'm at the point where I'm sort of, I don't give a frick, right? If people can't handle the truth or can handle discussing and no, you shouldn't say that word or this word or that word, right? The gloves are off now, right? That possibly, allegedly, this whole pandemic thing is one big scam in order to inject people with God knows what kind of bullshit for some ends that is not really clear yet, right? It's if these things are going on, and the central banks printing trillions and trillions of dollars and euros that is going to inflate people's savings, to the moon, right? And all these wars are being started here, and everything is fucking going down the drain. But then people are saying, no, you shouldn't use that word. That is nasty. You should be, what's it called? You should be cancelled, right? Because you're using words I don't like. My feelings. You're hurting my feelings. Come on, grow a fucking pair of balls, right? Or, whatever you have down there between your legs, and a spine, and some, whatever you need to. I mean, this is serious stuff, right? People have got things wrong in the 20th century to an extent that we can't even imagine, or even if we read the facts from wherever these kinds of facts are stated, at least 250 million people were killed by their own government in the 20th century. In the 20th century alone, 250 million people were killed by their own freaking government. Right? We are not counting wars and pandemics and, Spanish flu or whatever, right? Or missed opportunities or people dying or children dying because their fathers were dead or their mothers were dead or infancy or all these problems that have followed. It's staggering, right? And it's all based on shitty morals, which is based on shitty metaphysics, right? So this needs to get freaking right. It needs to be freaking good, right? We can't just fabulate about it. It's perfect. I've done it. It's superior. It's not a good argument. It's not enough. It has to work, right? It has to be useful by ordinary people everywhere in the world, because ordinary people are being led to the slaughter by a bunch of psychopaths who is running everything.
Brain imaging and functional MRIs and all that, regular experience shows us that, if you drink alcohol, that will somehow impact your brain function. We know that physiologically that happens, and that comes hand in hand with a change in how you feel in your inner experience. Or if you get punched in the face, that alteration of your physiological or metabolical brain function, or even anatomical brain function, can lead to vastly different inner experience. So whatever theory of reality we put forward, it cannot contradict any one of these facts, because these are sort of, theory-independent observations of the world and our role within it. So whatever theory of reality we come up with, not only cannot contradict them, hopefully it should make sense.
But what do you mean, a theory of reality? What are you talking about when you're saying reality? Are you referring to that which is behind experience? Or are you referring to my experience? Is that reality? What do you need a theory about that? What do you mean? A theory about the colors? Why they become colors? Nobody knows that. And in my opinion, nobody can explain why yellow is yellow and what the hell it is. You can't, and if you stick, it's just the waves or whatever, but that's another experience of something other than that might correlate to that color, but it doesn't explain why it's yellow, right? So what is it? What is that theory you are going for? I don't understand it, right? A theory of reality. What do you mean? And if you're talking about that which is behind reality, but ultimately becomes the experience of that reality, well, you just said that you basically can't do anything about it. So why spend time on it, right? It does what it does, as you say. So why spend time on it, right? You have no access to it, and you're saying it does whatever it does. So it's nonsense. It's stupid to spend time on it, right? Why don't you spend time on establishing some kind of knowledge from the reduction base of your metaphysics, and then work towards ethics and creating a perfect moral principle? Maybe that's what we should spend our time on, rather than fabulating about that which we have no access to and cannot change, right?
Of them should explain these three observations. Otherwise, it's a theory of reality without sufficient explanatory power. Now, before we get to the meat of it, let's take one step back and remind ourselves that matter, what we call matter, as conceptually defined.
I don't want to remind myself, so don't give me any orders, right, please? Why don't you just remind yourself, right? It's I know that it's a figure of speech to some extent, but you keep going in this we, and we're together, and we're in this experience together, sort of, you're grooming into a specific kind of mental state of some kind, right?
Under mainstream physicalism, namely that which can be exhaustively defined by a list of numbers that is purely quantitative and has nothing inherently qualitative to it, that conceptual notion of matter is a theoretical abstraction meant to try and explain the three observations of the previous slide, meant to try and make sense of displaying the three observations of...
There was a slide here. I'm going to read it out loud. It says, but matter is an explanatory model for these three observations, not itself an observation. Let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions. I know for sure that my pain exists, my green exists, and my sweet exists. Everything else is a theory. Later we find out that our perception obeys some laws, which can be most conveniently formulated if we assume that there is some underlying reality beyond our perceptions. This model of material world obeying laws of physics is so successful that soon we forget about our starting point and say that matter is the only reality. And it's signed by renowned Stanford physicist André Linde in 1998.
Try and make sense of these things that we just discussed.
Okay, he's switching between slides and I'm a bit confused.
Matter, in the way it is conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism, is not itself an empirical observation. It is a theoretical abstraction based on empirical observations.
Yes.
And physics, if you take this into account and you sort of, I acknowledge that matter is a sort of philosophical, theoretical entity, that physics shouldn't be dependent on it, then what is physics about, fundamentally? Before we bring in metaphysical theory into physics, what is physics in and of itself? Well, physicists who are a little bit more thoughtful about philosophy make no mistake in explaining what this is. I mean, this is a quote from Stanford physicist André Linde, who is very well known and respected for his theory of cosmological inflation. He put it in very simple and accurate terms. He said, let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with...
So he's very respected for his theory about... It's one of the elites and it's one of those that I like. So it's very good and renowned, right? I sort of appeal to authority, right? Fallacy.
With matter, but with perceptions. I know for sure that my pain exists, my green exists, and my sweet exists. Everything else is
I just read it out loud, and now he's reading out loud. I didn't know that. Okay, that's how it goes, right?
a theory. Later, we find out that our perceptions obey some laws which can be most conveniently formulated if we assume that there is some underlying reality beyond our perceptions. In other words, matter, for instance. This model of material world obeying laws of physics is so successful in practice that soon we forget about our starting point and say that matter is the only reality. You see, we replace the reality of perception with a theoretical abstraction called matter.
Yeah, but there is more to this than this. Reality is basically a story, right? That is pieced together in this sort of a collective kind of story, right? People are dependent on each other, so they want to know what is the story. And then this reality is created, right? And for some reason, people generally accept that there are a few people who can tell you what the story is about that reality, right? And because you are not the whole, you don't experience everything in the world. That's why politicians, I'm not going very much into politics, and I'm not into politics generally, right? But, well, I'm inspired, right? That's why they want to keep you in a sense where you can never get to the whole understanding of what is going on. So they need to tell you what the full story is. And because they're the one having the full story, they can order you around and tell you what to do because you don't have the whole story, right? That's why Dr. Fauci is telling you to take your fucking jab, because you don't know all the things, because he knows everything in the world, right? So reality has become some kind of huge story that you are a little piece of, but there are a lot of other people chipping in this story and creating stories and telling you there's a story over there that you should add to your story, right? What I would say that metaphysicians, physical philosophers should do is saying, no, all you have access to is your experience. That's the only place where you can get knowledge, right? Because it has to be empirical, right? You can't say that just because some guy over there said, I had an empirical experience yesterday, so now I'm telling you I had that empirical experience, and now you have that knowledge. No, it doesn't work, because you weren't there. And even if you were there, you aren't there anymore. Now it's in the past. Now it's a memory. A memory is not empirical data, right? It's not empiricism. So it's no longer knowledge. A memory is not knowledge, right? So this is where it should go, right? That reality is some collective idea of the full story of what the hell is going on in humanity and on planet Earth, right? And the more you can push people into some insignificant part of this story and say, you're a little peon, you don't understand the big picture, so we have to order you around, right? The better for those who want to order people around and steal their stuff, right?
And we forget that we are doing this, that we are making this move. We forget that it all starts from perception, and that physics ultimately...
It all starts from perception. There it is. If you by perception means your qualia, your set of qualia, and maybe your conceptualization objectifications like elephant and so on. You haven't been so clear on that. But let's say that it's the qualia. But yes, okay, it's all start there. So let's start there, right? Don't go behind it and fabulate what goes on behind that, right? So, I don't get it. Now you just said that's where it starts. Okay, so why are you not starting there, right? Why have you spent 1.5 to 2 hours before you even say that's where it starts? I don't get it.
Is a science of perception. Physics is the science that studies, models, and predicts the behavior of the...
You can't study a model, right? You can. I know he is just English isn't his first language either, so I bear with him, right? But you can't study models, right? You can create a model and try to refute it, right? That's what you're doing in science. You're saying, okay, I think it's little balls, right? Now I'm going to do something that is either refuting it, sort of a null hypothesis approach, right? I'm saying it's okay, it's there, but my test will ultimately possibly refute it, right? So it's like a model is something, if you can't have an understanding of how things work from a conceptual point of view, then you create a model which is a conceptualization of something you do not experience. But then the experiences have to fit with that model, so you test that model by setting up an experiment and see if what you expect in order for that to be the case is actually the case. Otherwise, that model has been refuted, or it at least had to be modified to fit with the reduced or whatever, purified, right? In order to become not in contradiction with your measurements.
Dials in our dashboard, if you recall from part 1 of this course. Indeed, as we've seen back then in part 1, what we call the physical world, the world with spatiotemporal extension of discrete objects moving and doing whatever they do, and fields and all that, that world is actually a dashboard of dials that evolution has equipped us with, so we can survive in face of the pressures of natural selection, and so that the variability or the variance of our inner states is kept. So our inner perceptual states does not have so much variation that we would dissolve into an entropic soup.
Okay, so what he's basically saying is, if you have that screen of experience, right? When you're doing physics and science in general, you are trying to describe and quantify what is going on there, right? You're not explaining what is going on. You're just saying, if this is the case and so much time will pass, then things will be the case in this way, following this formula, whatever, right? This is the model and the formula you have here. So go out and build a bridge or whatever, right? But it doesn't explain anything, right? It just basically tells you what does it do, rather than, and what to expect. If this happens, this will change to another color or whatever, right? So what does it do rather than what it is? It's not an explanation of anything about it, because it can't be explained, right? As I said before, you can't explain color, you can't explain elephant, right? You can't explain it. You can say it has these colors and these tastes and so on, but that's just a reference to the reduction base, which ultimately was responsible for you being able to objectify that particular object, right?
So instead of giving us a transparent window into the world as it is in itself, we are equipped with a dashboard of dials that caps our internal entropy as arising from perception. It caps the variability of our internal states. We've seen all this in part 1. So if that's what the physical world is, the dynamics of the dials on the dashboard, then what physics studies is the behavior of the dials, how the needles move with respect to one another. Maybe this needle is moving this way, and every time it moves this way, that needle moves the other way. And then we can write some mathematical equations relating the behavior of this needle here underneath to the behavior of that needle here on the top. This is physics. Physics studies, models and predicts the behavior of the dials on the dashboard, which is what we call the physical world as displayed on the screen of perception. Therefore, physics is a science of perception, or to say the same thing in different words, it's a science of the dashboard, of the dials on the dashboard, the behavior of the dials. Now, why I'm saying this as introduction? Because we have to guard against something that is damaging to philosophy and damaging to physics, which is to expect that physics will provide all the answers about what the world is in and of itself. It's too much to expect.
It's too much to expect of physics, absolutely. But it's also too much to expect of metaphysics. Metaphysics can't explain it either. Metaphysics should actually point out that you can't get to an explanation of anything, right? You can only figure out what the hell should I do with it, right? That's a decision you can make, right? You can make a decision that this is what I'm going to do when I experience this, right? And to a very large extent, science helps you with that. It's sort of a systematic rationalization about stuff, and when you have this kind of stuff in this scenario, then this is going to happen after so much time or whatever, right? It's a sort of there's a basic things you can go and read that people have done. It doesn't mean that you know it's the case, right? It's not knowledge. We are not talking about knowledge when we're talking about science, because science is based on knowledge. Otherwise, it's empirical, right? And then knowledge is based on empiricism. So you have to have empirical data, which is knowledge, in order to find out whether or not your science holds. So science cannot be knowledge, right? It's a model, it's a description, it's a glorified kind of crystal ball that helps you predict how things are going to move around in the future, so that you can place yourself in a favorable position when things are, evidentially going in that direction that you suspected to do based on your rationalizations, of which a part of it may be science, right?
From physics. It will fail, and this will be a disservice to physics. And it's also a disservice to philosophy that tries to do precisely that, as opposed to physics.
Okay, so if philosophy tries to explain your experience, well, then you are wrong, mate, right? Because philosophy cannot explain anything, right? It cannot. You can make a reduction, definitions of things, and then reduce it to your reduction base, right? But you can't explain the reduction base or your conceptualizations, and that's all you have from the starting point and the next level, which is the objectification. So all definitions are basically based on something that you can't explain. So just keep defining things doesn't mean you're explaining anything, because the foundations are inexplicable, right?
Because one, physics and all science, for that matter, all of science studies the behavior of nature, not what nature is. Why? Because that's what experiments can tell us. Experiments can tell us how nature behaves given a certain set of conditions. It doesn't tell us directly what nature is. Now, of course, knowing how nature behaves can inform our educated speculations about what nature might be. And some hypotheses about what nature might be contradict nature's behavior as observed through science. In that case, those hypotheses are simply wrong and should be discarded. But science does not settle questions of being. It only informs an attempt to answer those questions. What science settles are questions of behavior. And that's all we need to develop technology and improve our lives. If science helps us to play the game of life better, it needs to tell us how the game behaves, not what the game is. A 5-year-old kid can play a computer game and be a world champion because the kid knows how the game behaves. The kid knows that if he goes through that door, he will die. The character will die. Or if crosses that bridge, he will score points. That's the game's behavior.
Okay, I think I'll take a break here. We're approaching 1 hour, and we are 30 minutes and 12 seconds into the video. So with 10%, or even less maybe, I'm not even sure. No, that's not a little more than 10%, right? And I hope that what I'm trying to say is I'm going to make a part 6 and keep going in this. So hope to see you there, and bye bye.